Okay. So we're going to talk today about these what we call biosensors. To tell you frankly, this is a great field in chemistry, and it's a $1 billion industry because of one disease that can be found around the world. And Filipinos has this what we call the most of these diseases. Okay, and because of that disease, we could say they were able to make money out of the device. Okay, ang sabi nga nila, this is the main contribution of electrochemistry. So when we're talking about biosensor, we could say we're looking at an analytical device. Okay, and true to the meaning of bio, so that means it contains biological substance. It could be enzymes, antibody, tissues. Okay, that converts biological response into electrical, thermal, and optical signal. So if we're going to look at this, so maybe we can put here, there's a sensory level because we always need something that we could say sense the thing. So we could put the target analyte here. So parang lagyan natin na parang target doon. So once they, what we could do it here, so we have a transducer. So once the analyte bind, okay, in this what we call the sensory device, the sensory layer, not device. So what happened is there's a recognition, and it will allow, okay, the transducer to develop what we call a signal. Okay, so what is this signal? Usually it's a physicochemical signal, electrical, thermal, or optical. Right? So since we could say we are in electrochemistry in this course, we can look on the electrical, but we're going to discuss also the thermal and the optical signal. So the biosensor is composed of two components. First, the sensing element. Okay, so that's the sensory level. So the sensory element, that could be your biological component. And the second is what we call the transducer. So sensing element may be either enzymes, antibodies, DNA, tissues, or whole cells, which then produce the biochemical reaction into electrical signals or other what we call signals. So if we're going to look at the definition of these sensors, before, the classical definition is a self-contained integrated device that is capable of providing specific qualitative or semi-quantitative analytical information using a biological recognition element which is in direct spatial contact with the transduction element. So that's the definition of what we call a biosensor during the time that I graduated in college, 1998, as mentioned by IFA. So in here, okay, biosensor is not equal to a bioanalytical system. An enzyme electrode is a biosensor. Okay. Now, in the current definition, they define what we call a biosensor, or we could just say the sensor, as one that integrates a biological element with physicochemical transducer to produce an electronic signal proportional to a single analyte, which is then conveyed to a detector. So they become more a little bit, we could say, specific. Okay. And we could say the field of biosensors really, we could say, new. It was just born, what, in 1967, when an enzyme-based sensor was reported by Updike and Hicks. So what do you think the biosensor used for? Saan nyo, sa tingin nyo, saan ginamit yung biosensor na yun? The one that was developed by Updike and Heath. Anyone? The same thing as what we call the Clark developed. Okay, so it was an enzyme-based biosensor. Okay, and it was used for sugar. For Clark, it is what? Oxygen. But he used also what? Okay, anong ginamit ni Clark? He also used an enzyme. Okay, so if you're going to look at the history of this, what we call biosensors, really, we could say, a very new field. So for Leland Clark, ito na siya itsura niya, he invented the glucose sensor to determine the glucose level in the sample. But before that, it's not really for what? For glucose. Okay. So if you're going to look at the story of Leland Clark, unfortunately, I was not able to what we call the meet him. Okay. But his contribution in what we call the biosensors, we could say cannot be ignored. So he's known as the father of biosensor. He invented the Clark oxygen electrode. And this is, we could say, an important device that allows real-time monitoring of blood, the patient's blood oxygen levels, and has made surgery safer and more successful for millions around the world. Okay, and they found out that that Clark sensor can also be used for glucose. Now, the first enzyme base was used by Updike and Hicks in 1967. So imagine the time, 1967. So sino sa mga instructor dyan ang nag-ano na? Existing already during that time. Think. Wala na. Okay? So 1962, if you're going to look at the timeline, 1962 was when Clark and Lyons first described what a biosensor is. And then Updike and Hicks make the first practical enzyme electrode. Okay? And then in 1973, the glucose enzyme electrode based on the detection of hydrogen peroxide was what we call developed. And it's 1975, okay? The first commercial biosensor, a YSI analyzer, was what we call implemented. In 1976, the year I was born, you have the first bedside artificial pancreas. So those are, we could say, the milestone of this, what we call glucose biosensor. Okay, so later on, by the end, okay, I'm going to show you a table about this history as we go on. Okay, so if we're going to look at the components of the biosensor, so this is how it looks like. So yung pangit na drawing na ginawa ko. So you have an analyte, which is your target compound, and then you have the sensing biological elements. So it can be an enzyme, an antibody, a nucleic acid, a bacteria, a cell, a tissue, or an organelle. Sa tingin nyo, alin dito yung pinaka-practical? Well, it depends on what you want to analyze. Okay? They said enzyme, antibody, nucleic acid, especially enzyme and antibody, they're a little bit expensive. Although there are enzymes that are, we could say, available in cheap or low-cost thing. And the transducer that you have here, so depending on the type of the biosensors that you have, So the one that we have this semester's electrochemical biosensor. So you have an electroactive material, and it can be what? An electrode that is there in the transducer, and you can monitor it either what? Conductimetric, amperometric, and potentiometric. If it's an ion sensor, you have a semiconducting pH electrode. Okay, so any signal that goes to the electrode, it is in the form of an electrical signal. Now, some you can monitor any release of heat or absorption of heat. You have the thermal detection biosensor. And then one that has what we call light coming out, you can have the optical detection biosensor. And last but not least, there are biosensors that monitor the mass change, the piezoelectric medium. But in any case of this one, okay, as you could see, the transducer just serves as one that will release the signal. Okay. So usually this is the one that you have here. These are the different physicochemical properties that you can monitor. And if you're going to what we call look in a biosensor, so if you have a biosensor, usually you have what? A biological component and a physical component. So the biological component that you have there is this. So you can have the sensitive bioelement. And in the physical component, you have the transducer, and sometimes you add an amplifier. What does the amplifier do? Anyone? What does amplifier do? It increase the signal or increase the output. Okay, the word itself, amplifier, amplifies the signal. Okay, so sometimes you can include that thing. Okay, because what we really want is when we put our target analyte, we have a response, and we want the response to be what? Correlated to the target analyte. So either the signal increase or the signal decrease with an increase of the analyte. Okay. So if we're going to look at the principle behind a biosensor, so you have your sample analyte. So your sample analyte here as much as possible. One way a good biosensor would work is if the analyte is in a real sample. So that means there are other chemicals or compounds that is present aside from your target analyte. Why? Because you don't need to do what? Sample preparation. Okay, you want an analysis where you just put the sample right away and you determine if your target analyte is present and at what level it is present. Okay? Kasi kapag kailangan mo pa ng sample prep, then that's an additional time in your analysis. So what you want, you just put the sample and then you have the signal. Like you want to determine the blood sugar. So all you need to do is what? Put a drop of your blood, and then the number would be released. So that would be the most practical sensor that you have. Okay. And then in the recognition element, it can be a receptor, an antigens, antibody, enzymes, proteins, or nucleic acid, to name a few. You can have tissue. You can have what? Microorganism. So if you're going to look the sample that were given to you, the one that you need to write, the so-called modifier, usually this recognition element in one way or another would interact with your target analyte. Okay, so if you have an enzyme, what do you want the enzyme to target at? Usually a substrate, right? So what you see, any interaction of your analyte with this recognition or a bioelement, okay, will give you a signal. So antibody, ano bang ginagawa ng antibody? Anyone? So it's usually target the antigen or the antigen target an antibody. So each of them has a specific interaction with a particular analyte. Okay, so usually this recognition element are the one that makes the reaction, or we could say the biosensor specific for a particular target. Now, the question that you can ask now is how are you going to fix this biological material in the transducer? Okay, because after you have this one, you need a transducer. So here it could be a membrane, okay, it could be any material, okay, that will generate the signal based on the interaction of your biological component or element with the sample analyte. Now, the main trick that you're going, the main challenge that they have before is how are you going to incorporate the biological material with the transducer? So there are different ways. And usually you use the chemistry behind it. So once you have the transducer, you can put an amplifier that increase the output of the signal, and then you have the results. So you want it as much as possible quantitative. Or maybe first you can set qualitative. Answering the question, is the sample present? If the answer is yes, how much of the sample is present? Okay. Now, if we're going to look at the more on this, what we call the principle. So before we go on this, what we call enzyme, maybe the first thing that we're going to do is the analyte. Whenever you develop a biosensor, what's the first thing that you need to ask? Anyone? Magpapan lang ako. Pamatay kasi heater namin dito eh. When you develop a sensor, what's the first question that you ask? If specific po ba ang analyte? What's the first question that you want to ask yourself if you want to develop a sensor? Hindi ba pwedeng, ano ba gusto kong i-detect? What do I want to detect? What analyte do I want to measure, di ba? So, ano to? Molecule? Atom? Compound? Or we could say yung ionic compound? So usually, ano bang gusto mong i-detect? Ito ba ay protein? Toxin? Peptide? Vitamin? And of course, the one to rule them all, sugar. Or pwede mo ilagay na metal. Right? So, the analyte is the first thing that you're going to determined. Now, if you want it to be what? Successful, you're going to look for an analyte that has what? Importance. Sugar. Ano importance why we need to know the sugar level? Usually, health. How many Filipinos are diabetic? Or can we say most of the Filipinos are diabetic? Because of what? Bakit ang daming Pilipinong diabetic?
Lifestyle, sir.
Okay? Rice. Dahil sa bigas. Hindi talaga matanggal yung bigas. Okay? Now, the next question that we could ask is, if I found the analyte, what interaction will I use to at least sense or detect the analyte? So anong aanuhin ko dyan? So I could say, okay, if I'm looking for a sugar, is there a biological substance that when it interacts, okay, there's a reaction, and possibly the reaction that they have or interaction that they have would generate signal. So if you have an enzyme, usually what you have in the enzyme, it target a particular substrate, okay? So kahit ilagay mo ng ibang component, what the enzyme do is it's going to be specific to a particular substrate. And the challenge that you're going to have now is, how are you going to put that, we could say, biological component into a transducer? How are you going to deliver the analyte to the sensitive region? Okay. Or maybe from here, the question that you have in the first one is what? What do you want to detect? And the second one is how do you deliver the analyte to the sensitive region? And then after that, the one that we answered, how do you specifically recognize the analyte? So pag antibody, paano yung recognition? Yung ba yung parang Y? Right? Tapos may parang ano sila dyan, binding sites. Now sa cell, paano yung recognition kapag cell yung meron ka? Usually meron kang, is that a membrane receptor? Sorry, ano na yung biology ko eh. And then you can use what? A polymer hydrogel thing, you could do binding. Okay? So how are we going to do this thing? Because the next thing that we're going to do is, how do you know where there's a detection? Yes, nag-bind yung analyte mo, let's say, sa protein. Nag-bind yung analyte mo sa enzyme. So how do we know? Pero ang main challenge talaga dun is, how are you going to combine your biological component with the transducer? In the paper that you do, how did you do that? You just mix them, right? You just mix whatever what we call the modifier with ano yung transducer nyo doon? Carbon-based electrode. Now, the way to do it is you can do this one. Matrix entrapment or membrane entrapment. You can also do some of this reaction like what? Covalent modification. Ano pa? Ano yung different ways na pwede mo i-entrap yung material mo? How are you able to fix paano mo ma-didikit yung biological component doon sa transducer? You familiar with sol gel? Is it the first time you hear the word sol gel? You're familiar with the glass. Okay? Yung sol gel, usually what it do is this is a hydrolysis of this organosilane from a salt solution until they become into a gel. So yung gel parang tinatawag nating glass-like property. So parang yung tinatawag na salt gel from a liquid going to a solid. So once they become what we call solid, you can entrap the biological component. I have experience using sol gel, okay? And the way I put the sol gel there is, first I try to entrap an enzyme, and then I try to entrap an antibody. So the thing is, when you form this, what we call gel material or gel matrix, the enzyme and the antibody are too big to be removed. So ang pwede lang lumabas-pasok doon ay yung target analyte mo because of the size. Okay? Because you're trying to fix them into a transducer. It's a very good field, yung tinatawag na sol gel modified or sol gel modification. And then they can also have, you familiar with this? Polymerization. Now, sometimes the way that they do the thing is the so-called molecular imprinting. So what do they do? So they use a polymer if it's an organic base, or they use a sol gel if it is an organic base. So what they do, they allow the polymerization to occur, and what happens is you put a target analyte there, and what you do is you remove them. So if you remove your target analyte, parang magkakaroon siya ng imprint. So let's say ito yung target analyte mo. So when you remove it, it forms a cavity of your target analyte. So when you have sample that contains your target analyte, it will just fits in on the cavity that was formed. And once it fits in there, you can have a transducer that monitors the signal that there's binding. Now the question is, how do you know, okay, or how do you know that there is a detection? So dito pumapasok yung different signaling principle. You can have the optical, okay, the electrical, the one that we have in this thing, electromechanical, thermal, magnetic, and pressure. So often the detector is immobilized or the sensor. And this immobilization permits the repeated use of the usually expensive biological substance. Okay? So if you're going to look at the working principle here, so you have what? The substrate to be detected. So the analyte diffuses from the solution to the surface of your biosensor. So you have the substrate here. It passed through a thin outer membrane. So your analyte was diffuses from the solution to the surface, okay, of the biosensor. So once it passes through the what we call thin outer membrane, it is detected by the recognition system, the biological system that you have. The one that is either immobilized enzyme, antibodies, or cell. So here, the analyte would react specifically and efficiently with the biological component of the biosensor. Okay, now what happened? This reaction or interaction, okay, there's an interaction of the substrate and the immobilized detector. So this interaction changes the physicochemical properties of your transducer surface. So it could be products produce electrical current, chemical gas, or heat generation. Now, everything would happen on what? The transducer. Okay? So any changes that's due to the interaction of your substrate or target analyte and your biological recognition element, okay, if it's done in the transducer, it converts the product level into a conventional electrical signal. And the change in this optical, electrical, magnetic, thermal properties is measured and converted into a signal. So usually you have an amplifier there, and you will have it in the readout output signal. So we could say this is the working principle of any biosensor that you have. So try to imagine, pwede ba natin sabihin na yung CPE na ginagawa ninyo is biosensor? In some case, yes. Especially if you use a biological material. Okay? So, alin doon sa inyo? I think not all of you has the biological material there. Okay? But I think the one that you have, what? The plant parts? That is a biological material. I don't know. The one I can remember is we have the banana trode, the piña trode. Aling trode sa inyo ang merong ano? Meron ba sa inyo yung pipino? Somebody get the cucumber? Oh, apple trode. So if you're going to look at this, they contain some materials there. Piña trode, it has an enzyme. These enzymes sa piña, bromelain. That's why if you put this in meat, the meat tastes better because it's a hydrolytic enzyme that breaks down the muscles of the meat. So in the apple trode, you have tyrosinase. I don't know, if you cut an apple, you leave it exposed, nagiging brown. So what enzyme causes that browning? Okay? Ganon din sa banana, di ba? Pag iniwan mo bukas, sometimes nagba-brown siya. So sino pa ibang may ano sa inyo? Biological material. So siguro yung mga oil. I think meron bang coconut oil sa inyo? Okay. Yung kangkong is mostly on what? A cell wall, bacterial cell wall, by plant materials as we call it. So those are what we call the thing in the working biosensors. And what we have here is just an example and maybe some of the component that you have, the interaction that we have. So we have this resonant piezoelectric biosensor. Now, among the biosensor, I think this is one that I don't have experience using. Okay. But they said, if you have this is a sensitive one. the piezoelectric, what we call sensor. So usually it's a device that uses the piezoelectric effect to measure changes in pressure, acceleration, okay, temperature, strain. Now, the way that they try to look at this one is analyte antigen. So what they do use there as a biological element is an antibody. Antibody is one of the expensive biological materials. I remember, I think 1 milligram of one antibody costs 300, and that's why, what, 18 years ago to 2005. And the transducer that it has here is the so-called acoustic wave. So the signal that they have there is in the change in the frequency and mass measured. So I think this is, we could say, the most sensitive. When we're talking about mass here, we're not talking about gram level, milligram level. We're talking about at a much lower level. Okay. So if you're going to look at this the way that they do, so this is your surface acoustic wave. So you have a piezoelectric substrate there. So they put the antibody there. So usually it's a microfluidic channel. So they input the thing here. So when it passes through there, so any analyte would bind with the antibody. Okay, so when it passes through here, so it will be detected by the what we call the piezoelectric substrate, the surface acoustic wave. So usually, the analysis that we have right now is using the microfluidic channel. Are you familiar with the case of Theranos? Have you heard this case of Theranos? Class? So if you're going to look at the name Theranos, it's usually shortened for therapeutic diagnostic. Yeah, that's a scam one. The name is what? Elizabeth Holmes? So he tried to be the next, sino ba yung sa Apple guy? Steve Jobs. So what he said, what if we have a device that when you put a drop of your blood, it can determine all compounds that is related to health. So ang daming nag-invest. I think he was able to make around what, $10 billion of investment. And then they tried to develop the thing and they found out it's not possible. I think the technology is around 5 to 10 years from now possible. But during that time, it's not possible. So the principle that they have there is similar to this one. But instead of just targeting one analyte, they want to target everything that is connected with what? Health. Okay, so cholesterol, sugar, cortisol. So they put some of these devices in Walgreens, yung counterpart ng mercury drug dito, and the test that they have is just the level of some of the compounds is just so high. That's why naisip mo, may sakit ka kapag nakita mo yung result na nakuha. But the principle that they have is similar to this one. Okay? And then you also have this optical detection biosensor. So if you have an optical detection biosensor, so what does it mean? You're looking at colorimetric. So this is what? For color. Measure the change of the light absorbance. Or, may isang term pa na tinatawag na photometric. So what is photometric means? Ano yung tinitingnan niya? Anyone? Pag photometric, ano tinitingnan niya? Light. Photo. Not picture, okay? Photo as in photosynthesis. So it looked at the light intensity. So here it changes the measure of absorbance for color. Here it measure or detects the photon output. So you can use here also an antibody taking advantage of the analyte antigen interaction. And you can have a transducer here, a silicon wafer exposed to UV light. And the signal that it will generate is you measure the light. So maybe like this one. Okay. So you have some surface coating there, titanium oxide substrate with optical grating. Okay. So you have a light source there. You pass your sample. There's a UV light that interacts there. So there's multi-wave light. And then the one that will reflect the interaction of your analyte with, okay, the material that you have there, it can reflect back. And you can monitor it in a spectrometer. So the principal of optical biosensors are devices that utilize the principle of optical measurements. Sorry sa ingay. Yung washer namin. So it can be absorbance, fluorescence, or chemiluminescence. But the common one I would say is this one. Most materials can absorb, especially if it's colored materials. Fluorescence is just limited for fluorescent sample. The same thing with chemiluminescence. Now, the idea here is the absorbance is related to the concentration of the analyte. And typically, you have a biorecognition element here, a light source, an optical transducer, and the display. Okay, and one thing that you can look is just like this. So you have your analyte in the sample, okay? So you pass it through a flow cell or a flow channel. So if you have there an antibody or a receptor, so once it binds there, what it do? Either the absorbance go up or the absorbance go down. But you can only monitor it if it's the light source is put to that. So any changes of the absorbance should be related to the concentration of your analyte. So this is the principle of this what we call optical biosensor. Now, use blood glucose level. We might say, oh, isn't it electrochemical lang ang nag-ano sa glucose level? No, you have this optical one. So you have there an immobilized enzyme like glucose oxidase. Now you might see why glucose oxidase is the one used here. And then your horseradish peroxidase and this chromogen. So chromogen, that's the coloring agent. So you have here tulidin. I don't know if you're familiar with tulidin. Is it the first time you hear that tulidin? So if it's a tulidin, ano kaya yan? Related sa toluene? So most likely this toluidine is what? A colored reagent. Okay, so the intensity of the color of the dye, which is your chromogen, can be measured by using a portable reflectance meter. So the way that they do is they have a glucose strip production, and it's a very big industry worldwide. Now we go on the other one, the thermal, or in some they call it the calorimetric. Yung mga name natin, colorimetric, coulometric. So it's an analyte antigen interaction, and bio element that usually here is the immobilized enzyme, and your transducer is a thermistor. What is a thermistor? Doon sa mahilig sa electronics. Thermistor, they said, is what? A combination of thermal resistor. So usually they said it's a resistance thermometer, or a resistor whose resistance is dependent on temperature. And what it measured, or what it generated, is a heat measurement. So we could say you use it for absorption or production of heat. Okay, so the way that they have this one, so this is similar to what in your Chem. Meron ba tayo nito? Or yung copy cup calorimeter pa rin? Ah, sira. Oh my God. So, ang Chem dyan hanggang picnometer na lang. Do you know what a picnometer is? So if you're going to look at it, it's almost similar to a bomb calorimeter. Now, you could see here, I don't know if you've done electronics. So usually, this is what? Meron tayong signal na ganito, di ba? I just taught this week in my analytical. This is what? A battery or a potential, and this is what we call a resistor. So the way that you're going to look at this, you have an enzyme column here. So there's a reference. So parang ano to double beam spectrophotometer. Okay? Tapos i-inject nyo doon yung sample. So papas doon yung sample. So any interaction of your sample that contains the analyte with the enzyme there, it can generate heat. So parang tinitake advantage dito yun what? Exothermic, endothermic reaction. So any changes in the temperature that is detected by the resistor or thermistor, which is resistor temperature. Now, the advantage of this is you don't need to have a frequent calibration. And it is insensitive to electrochemical and optical properties of the sample. And they use it usually for what? Pathogenic bacteria and pesticides. So the heat generated is proportional or related to the analyte concentration. So you have a thermal sensor that's that you need there, an enzyme immobilized that's free on the thermal sensor, the thermocouple, and then a display. So these are the components of the thermal biosensor. Okay, so you can look at it another way of this thermal biosensor working. So you can see there's an enzyme there, 3-column. So you pass through your sample here, okay, and then you have always a reference column and an enzyme column there. So whatever you pass through the sample there, it will give you a signal, analyte interact with the enzyme. Medyo ano yung internet ko Wala na nagamit na iba. Choppy ba ako from time to time? Mukha nga, wala nasagot eh. Okay. So, kala nyo, first world country, okay na yung internet. Hindi, sa bahay lang. Sa school, okay. Sometimes I cannot open the SAIS or the canvas here at home. So if you're going to look at the application of this, what we call the thermal or thermometric biosensors, they use for the estimation of cholesterol. So the thing that you need to do, if you want to develop a biosensor, is look for a market, right? If you want to have big, to be rich, you look for a market. Okay? So ano ba usually yung problema ng human population? So sugar and cholesterol. Because they said 100 years ago, the main cause of death is what? Infection. So antibiotic solves that. Now, this, what we call during this time, what's the main cause of death? Anyone? Ano yung main cause of death at this time? Lifestyle diseases, right? Heart diseases, yeah. So that means you have to find something to solve them. So if you can find a medicine that cures diabetic, you can get rich. And when that happens, the first thing that you're going to do is invest your security. Because a lot of people would like you dead. Because you're going to kill $1 billion industry. From the sugar strip until doon sa mga medicine. Right? So if you want cholesterol, are you familiar with Lipitor? Familiar ba kayo sa Lipitor? What is Lipitor? Doon sa magdodoktor. Lipitor is used for what? Lipid detector. It's a medication for cholesterol. Oo nga, combine mo lipid detector, pwede mo sabihin Lipitor. It's atorvastatin. Okay? And it's what we call a cholesterol medication. And it's also a $1 billion industry. So if you are old, usually yung maintenance mo is either what? Either or. Okay? Medication for high sugar and high cholesterol. Okay? So the way that they do, they develop it to detect cholesterol. So when cholesterol gets oxidized by the enzyme cholesterol oxidase, heat is generated. So they take advantage of that heat. So the more cholesterol that you have, the more heat that it will generate. So yan yung principle na ginagamit nila dito. Okay? Now, the last one, before we go to the electrochemical, is the so-called ion sensitive biosensor. So we could say this is just your what? ISE pero sensor type. Okay. So I think when we have potentiometry, we talk about IS-FED or the FED, okay, the field effect transistor. So if you're going to look at this, you can use IS-FED biosensor. So usually it's analyte antigen, but you target the ion. Okay. And the bioelement that you have is antibody. So yung transducer mo is a semiconductor, FEDs, so the feed the electric transistor. So usually they are ion sensitive surface. That's why if you're going to look ion sensitive, kaya ang target niya is mga ions. Okay? And what do we do? The signal that we have is just the pH change measured. So usually you use it for pH or any other ion. Okay, so it just measures the change in potential. Okay, so we could say it's a specialized type of a pH meter. Now let's go to this one, the electrochemical biosensors. So it can be what? Conductimetric, amperometric, which is the basis of your glucose biosensor, or potentiometric. Okay, so if you're going to look at the principle in this what we call electrochemical biosensors, okay, you could say that it's based on the change in the chemical reaction that produce or consumes ions or electrons. So usually there's many chemical reactions that produce or consumes ions or electrons, causing electrical change in the electrical properties of the solution that can be sensed or measured. Okay, so if I'm not mistaken, Leland-Clark electrode that is based on this what we call electrochemical biosensors. And Leland-Clark, the glucose biosensors that he had, he used what? What's the electrode do you think that he used? Anyone? He used platinum electrode. Okay. So if you're going to look at this, what we call electrochemical biosensors, so you say electricity or potential or voltage is generated depending on the analyte concentration. All here is a biorecognition element. Okay, you have a transducer and what we call a display. So we could say that an electrochemical biosensors would look like this. Okay, so you have the analyte, and then any of these can be, ano, wala, may ano na naman. Choppy na naman. It says to me here. Okay, so it can be a receptor, a DNA, an antibody. Okay, so substrate here producing a product, that's an enzyme or microbial thing. So you have this sensing biocom element, which is biological in nature with the transducer, it can produce signal. And if you're going to look at the basis here of the glucose biosensor, siguro kahit ito na lang yung ano, kasi ito yung talagang ano billion-dollar industry. Okay? So usually in the strip, in a what we call glucose meter strip, what you have there is what? Did I put the thing here? Oh, wala. Ano na? what you have there is an immobilized enzyme membrane. And that membrane is what? Immobilized membrane is the glucose oxidase. Okay. So your analyte is the glucose. This is your immobilized enzyme membrane. So your transducer can be what we call the graphite electrode that we have in the paper that you're going to complete. So what happened? The glucose oxidase reacts with glucose to produce gluconic acid. More glucose, more oxygen is consumed. Okay, so as you could see in the reaction here, glucose oxidase plus what we call the oxygen, it produces glucose oxidase and H2O2. Now, if you have less glucose, what happened? Because you could see here, you have two types of glucose oxidase, the reduced form and the this is the oxidized form and the reduced form. Okay. So more glucose, more oxygen is consumed. Less glucose, more hydrogen peroxide is consumed. So if you're going to look at this, so this is what happened, H2O2 producing H2O. And usually a mediator would replace the oxygen accepting the electron and pass it into the electrode, and that's generate current. So that means the more glucose that you have, the higher is the current. So that's the principle that you have in a glucose biosensor. And I think I have a paper on this when I was in Austria, but it was published there in Philippine Journal of Science. We tried to measure the glucose, but we mix it. The glucose oxidase, we mix it with another one. So the way that we do it is, I think I use ano ba yung disaccharide. And what I do is I put the disaccharide in enzyme 1. Okay, I'm not sure if it's lactose. Ano yung sugar na glucose? You have a glucose and another glucose. Anong disaccharide yun? Anyone? Is it maltose? Pero pag lactose is producing galactose and glucose ba yun? Am I right?
Yes,
Because
sir.
I remember when I was in Austria, so we have this disaccharide, and what the PI told me to do, I want you to determine the way wherein you can separate this disaccharide into glucose. So parang meron akong dalawang enzyme doon na in-immobilize. So yung isang way is mixing. So minix ko yung dalawang enzyme. Tapos yung isang way, sequencing. So when you sequencing, papasok dito yung sample, mauuna yung magbe-breakdown sa disaccharide. Tapos doon sa isang side yung glucose oxidase. Tapos yung isa is what we call layering. So layer ng glucose I think kalimutan ko isang enzyme, but I know the one enzyme is the lactose. So one enzyme and then another enzyme. Tapos titingnan yung performance ng which is the most effective immobilization method. But all sugar sensor or all sugar meter, like the one that I use, has this principle. Okay. So the glucose then is affected by the glucose oxidase. So the reaction is just based on this and this. So H2O2 is some sort of what? The one that is really being measured there. So if it's less glucose, more hydrogen peroxide, that is what we call consumed. Okay. So it will be what we call act upon in the electrode to produce the current. So that's the main principle of this, what we call sugar meter. Now, if you're going to look at the application, okay, for this sensor, so we could say we can use it for pollution detection. So you can isolate specific pollutants. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this term LAX gene coupled. So this is just an rDNA technology, a reporter gene. So usually it's fluorescence that you have there. Now, usually the typical method that you use is spectrochromatography, immunoassay, and monoclonal antibodies in addition to this sensor. Now, in the food industry is another, we could say, way you can apply it. So usually what do you detect there? Carbohydrates, sugar, alcohols, and then food safety in meat. And beverages. So usually you use it for quality assurance in food. And the method that you have there is a flow injection system. Okay, so I think those are just some of the application. Now, in terms of the advantages, so it can be highly sensitive, okay, eco-friendly, simple fabrication, you can monitor it in situ or in real time. Mass production is easier. Right now, they go for this, what we call paper sensor. Highly specific to analyte, cheap, fast response, and you can have an accurate measurement. I remember my goal, pwede ba natin sabihin, nasirang pangarap ko, is when I go back there, is to produce like a paper sensor for all those compounds of interest. Okay, because we're already close to this, what we call shabu sensor. If you, what we call, take a sample of your pee, if you use shabu, it would change color, some sort of that. I don't know if uso ba sa atin yung, you know, this rape drug, rohypnol, if I'm not mistaken. Hindi ko na alam kung yung tama yung spelling. So here, some college kids developed yung panggamit sa cutex. Ano bang tawag doon sa English? So what they do, if your drink is spiked with this rape drug, okay, you can just put the finger that has yung cutex sa kalimutan ko. Ano tawag doon yung inaano mo sa skin, yung cutex, yung pinukulayan mo?
Nail polish, sir.
Oh, nail polish. Okay, so you mix yung it's a chromogen. So if you put it as an active ingredients of your nail polish, so if you mix your drink, so kapag present yung rape drug, may changes na nag-happen. Although I remember here in Patient University, the student affairs give them like a strip. So if you drop a drink there that contains rape drug, may color changes na mangyayari. So, yan yung ano ngayon ng mga tinatawag nating sensor. Practical purpose. Disadvantage, unless you what we call study it for a long time, usually yung reproducibility nila hindi really maganda. Okay, temperature dependent system, so they still affected by temperature. So what may work here in the US may not work there in the Philippines. Okay, and then pH influences can affect the performance and yung need for sample preparation. So yun yung we could say disadvantage no sensor. But as I can tell you, if ever hindi mo pa alam kung saan ka pupunta, biosensors is a very good field, a practical field. And you can make money of it if you can find commercial application. Yun lang yung masasabi ko about this thing. If I have the time to go back and what we call look for a field, ito talaga yung gusto ko. But what do you think the reason bakit hindi ko to pursue? Anyone? Why do you think I changed my specialization? Ano sa tingin niyo yung rason? Anyone? Now you ask yourself, if you have already a specialty in chemistry right now, what do you think will be the main reason for you to change or give up that specialization? Money? Greener pasture. Money din yun, di ba? Usually mentor. So when I arrive at UB, the electrochemical person is a very old guy. I think during that time, 80-year-old. So I think wala na siyang funding. So money is one of the costs. So I told myself, I think this is not the one for me. Kasi kung itutuloy ko siya sa kanya, baka hindi ako makatapos on time. But I really want to do electrochemistry during that time. Okay, so if you going to, maybe now you know why I asked you to write those remaining pieces. Kuha na ako na cup drops. Na ano na yung nalamunin ko. But I tell you right now, the sensor people are usually the one in University of Santo Tomas. They have a very big field of electrochemistry there under academician Fortunato Sevilla. Okay. Now in UP, I know there's a guy in UP Diliman who is doing electrochemistry stuff. So in UPLB, I think the one that is closest to an electrochemistry is Ma'am Leah. Okay. So that's it. Na, inaccept nyo ba yung ano ko sa Google Classroom?